To do that. Okay, so today's event is part of Israeli Apartheid Week, and it's one of many events being held around the world today and this week where people are coming together to stand against Israeli settler colonialism, apartheid, and genocide. In alignment with that, we want to remind everyone that this event has a no tolerance policy for chauvinism, racism, or any other form of discrimination. And so for now, we will leave the chat open, but we may turn it off if those principles are not respected. So as we speak, the Israeli genocide in Palestine is continuing. The massacres have not stopped, and beyond Gaza, Palestinians in the West Bank are also facing bombardment, forced displacement, home demolitions, and more. And while Palestine will be at the center of our discussion tonight, we also want to acknowledge that genocide and oppression are not confined to a single space. The catastrophic situations in Sudan and the Congo remind us that the forces that are driving war, displacement, and exploitation are a global phenomenon. One of the things the movement for Palestine has made clear, though, is that not everyone fighting for Palestine is also fighting against all forms of oppression. Some are selectively using the Palestinian struggle to fit their own narratives and their own interests, ignoring injustices elsewhere, including those happening right next door. So that's why we're here. We want to make connections, challenge this hypocrisy, and insist that our solidarity be principled. We know that this region has a long history of solidarity with Palestine, both at the state level and in grassroots movements. We're going to discuss some of that history tonight, both its strengths and weaknesses. We also know that going forward, our movements for Palestine are stronger when we are united. The question is, how do we build that unity? The first step is to mend the divides that exist here in the Balkans. We cannot adequately fight for the liberation of another people if we do not support liberation for our neighbors and for all oppressed people. True solidarity is not conditional, and if we want to be effective, we have to practice it everywhere. Of course, tonight's conversation will not cover everything. We won't be able to speak to every struggle in the Balkans, and neither of us claim to be experts at all. But this is just the beginning. We want to have more conversations, more events, more spaces like this. So again, if you want to be a part of that, we'll post the sign up link. It's in the chat. Please do join us. And with that, I want to hand it over to my colleague and dear friend, Arbor Cherkagashi. Hopefully I said that right.
Yeah, perfectly said. Thank you so much, Anna. It's lovely to be here with you all today. My name is, like Anna said, Arbor Kogoshi. I was born and raised in East London. My parents originally come from Kosovo. They left Kosovo at a point in its history that was very brutal. They left in the early 90s as the situation was unfolding in the rest of the former Yugoslav region. As my practices are really concerned with archiving history, culture. As a curator, writer, and researcher, I'm massively invested in looking to the past, specifically within Kosovo, to understand my present and the way that identities are formed today. A big part of my work is really focused at trying to bridge the gap between communities within Kosovo, trying to look towards Kosovo's history as a way to foster more into ethnic and cultural engagement. I'm the founder of a platform known as Balkanism on Instagram. It's a social media platform for the last 5 years, but we've also transformed into a publication and we host a variety of different events as well. For the last 2 or 3 years, I've been organizing spaces for the Balkan diaspora in London to engage with their cultures in a place that feels safe and that is also very clear when it comes to issues of ethno-nationalism, discrimination, chauvinism, all those problematic systems that are often very prominent in many Balkan cultural spaces. Um, Today is such an important conversation because we need to be able to bridge conversations regarding inter-ethnic solidarity, but also the fundamental issues that have occurred throughout our histories. And both me and Anna think it's quite poignant, especially from the communities that we come from, kind of bringing this kind of like space, creating this space and engaging in these conversations so that we're able to and like Anna said, no, we're not experts necessarily on certain issues, and these themes are so wide-reaching and touch on so a multifarious complexity of lived experience. So for us, we just wanted to be able to provide the space and start a conversation and look back towards history as a way to motivate us, whether in the diaspora or within the Balkans itself.
Yeah, definitely well said. And sorry, I completely did not introduce my background. Many might be confused. I'm in Serbia, but I have an American accent. So yeah, my parents are Serbian, but they immigrated to the US in 1991. So I grew up in the US, but I've since moved back to Belgrade. So just uh, just to explain that. All right. So, with all of that, we'll jump right in. So, just to kick us off, Arbor, can you start us with a little bit of an overview of the struggles in the Balkans and how we can begin this conversation around like the positives and the negatives of that shared history?
Mhm. So there's been a lot of struggle in the Balkans. The development of the nation state in the 19th and 20th centuries caused profound discontent throughout the entire region, causing issues of genocide, ethnic cleansing, forced expulsion, forced assimilation across the entire region. And it was the development of the ethno-nationalist state that caused this massive kind of these issues to really take hold within the vast majority of the Balkan region. And the vast majority of individuals in the region can also claim historical experiences of displacement due to the rise of the concept of the nation state within the region. Now, when looking back to solidarity struggles between communities, I wanted to I think we all individually have those individual experiences of solidarity struggles amongst the completely different context that we come from. I know for myself, I was raised with certain stories of inter-ethnic solidarity within my own family's history and the way it was kind of very poignantly conveyed to me. And these stories were really important in humanizing communities that come from different parts of Kosovo, but also the Balkan region. But when we look at kind of like solidarity struggles, a lot of my research was looking at the Second World War and the collaboration between the Yugoslav partisans or the Yugoslav Communist Party and the Albanian Communist Party. I firstly want to preface this by saying I'm not endorsing either one of these parties or the regimes that they fundamentally set in, because they were both very flawed in nature, and the impact that they caused on their respective communities is definitely felt. But the kind of joint collaboration between the Albanian and Yugoslav partisans during that period to fight against fascist occupiers, whether it be Italian occupation from 1941 to 43 or the German occupiers 43 to 45, is very significant. You also see, the Communist Party of Yugoslavia leveraging its resources to support Albania in the establishment of its own national liberation army. Again, we're not trying to kind of endorse these parties and what they became, but I think it's important to convey that kind of visceral response to what was fascist occupation of the Balkan region at that time. Communities seeing the necessity to collectivize together, even though they potentially had certain issues amongst themselves in order to fight a much bigger issue at the time, which was obviously fascist occupation. Um, and when I was looking at this more intensely, something very much came to mind. I remember going to Kosovo as a young child and seeing a very poignant building in the middle of central Pristina, and colloquially it was known as Boro Ramiz. And this referred to a specific fighter, a Serbian fighter known as Boro Vukmirovic and Ramiz Sadiko. And during the Second World War, they were both in Kosovo and fighting a part of various communist factions with each other. Now, the story has been, of course, hyper romanticized within the Yugoslav context. Various streets are given their names, obviously, buildings and spomeniks were given these names as a way to forward the whole kind of like Yugoslav brotherhood and unity. And it's often presented in a highly nostalgic, Yugo-nostalgic way sometimes. But I think that there is value within that story itself from kind of like a natural response that these two individuals joined forces with one another in order to defeat a common evil, which at the time was Italian fascist occupation. They were both, obviously, one was a Serb, one was an Albanian. And I think that fundamentally questions the notion notion of us having these deepened ancient hatreds, the fact that we were able to actually collectivize at a point where we were facing profound violence. And it was said that they both died kind of like, or were eventually murdered, kind of like screaming notions of solidarity amongst each other, which I think is very poetic and also very poignant to that time period. And when I looked into Ramiz Sadiq's life more generally, I saw that he had been a part of various kind of socialist movements in Yugoslavia prior to the Second World War. He had been a part of drafting a decree to speak about the national equality of Albanians in the Kingdom of Yugoslavia itself. What I also found very poignant is that a part of the decree itself, there were various signatures a part of that, and individuals from completely different ethnic communities within Yugoslavia at the time also signed that. And that eventually actually made its way to the League of Nations in Geneva at that time period. So I found it very poignant how an Albanian was forwarding, obviously, the issue of Albanian representation and also political abilities during that time, at a time in Yugoslavia that was very detrimental for people. So, and I wanted to provide some more kind of like context behind the Albanian experience within Yugoslavia between 1918 to 1941. So this was the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, or also in the beginning known as the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes. And it was a very, very brutal time for Albanian people, not only in Kosovo, but also in Macedonia, Montenegro, and Serbia. They were experiencing a variety of different forms of settler colonialism, forced displacement, a lack of educational resources, a lack of political representation. There was at one point a party for the Muslims of Yugoslavia known as the Cimjet, but that was completely disbanded in 1925. And so the life of Albanian people in Kosovo and the wider former Yugoslav region was very, very brutal. We also then see the implementation of a form of settler colonialism, whereby Serbia and Montenegro were bringing down Serb colonists from different parts of Serbia to forcibly alter Kosovo's ethnic demographic. You also see the establishment of over 300 villages, Serbian villages in Kosovo during this period. So a very systematic attempt at changing and altering Kosovo's ethnic composition. And this obviously had very detrimental effects on Kosovo's native populations, whether it be Albanians or Serbs or Turks or whatever the population may have been. And it caused a massive hierarchy within Kosovo's community at the time itself. So when I was looking into Sadiq's work and what he fundamentally did by creating this decree to focus on the Albanian equality in Yugoslavia at the time was very, very important because it conveyed the fact that also some other communities were recognizing the realities of the Albanian experience in Yugoslavia at that time in the face of what was settler colonialism and also forced displacement as well. So again, we look at, for example, the collaboration of Albanian and Yugoslav partisans and communists during the Second World War, and that was very much a positive, focused against a common evil at the time. But there were also a lot of negatives that came with that because a fundamental issue between the Albanian and Yugoslav communists were their views on Kosovo. What exactly, and a lot of Albanians in Kosovo were very apprehensive to work with a lot of Yugoslav communists at that time due to the realities of what would happen to Kosovo post-war. The memory of living under the Kingdom of Yugoslavia was very much fresh in our collective memory, and we did not want to be under a system once more where our rights were completely kind of like taken away and we didn't have that right to self-determination. There was a very poignant and very pivotal conference known as the Boyan Conference of 1943, which is often completely negated from a lot of Yugoslav discourses where Albanian and Yugoslav partisans got together and they were to discuss the status of Kosovo post-war, post the Second World War. And it was decided that Kosovo would be able to decide its future, have that sense of self-determination moving forward post Second World War. And although a lot of the Yugoslav communists during that time period were very apprehensive to agree to this, they initially did. But post Second World War, there was a complete shift. And obviously, we know as history was moved forward, Kosovo was reintegrated into Yugoslavia as an autonomous region, later province of the former Yugoslavia during that time period. But obviously, this didn't match up to the demands of those that were a part of this conference, which specifically stated that Kosovo would have the ability to define its status post Second World War, and the vast majority of peoples in Kosovo wanted to either reunify with Albania or potentially have republic status. And so this was a very difficult and tumultuous time in Kosovo itself, but also conveys both the positives and the negatives of inter-ethnic solidarity throughout the Balkan region's history, more specifically around Kosovo, Albania, and Yugoslav relations itself. Now, when looking back at this, what we need to understand and what we need to learn is that our solidarity cannot be conditional with one another. We need to be able to establish a sense of solidarity on an inter-ethnic basis that fundamentally states, if I have self-determination, you should also have self-determination too. Because fundamentally, we need to be able to create a society and a system where individuals have that access to equality, equity, and liberation for all. And this kind of like wishy-washy approach, potentially when it comes to Yugoslavia and its engagement with Albanians and people from Kosovo, was very significant because we see Tito in 1945 actively stating that settler colonialism as a scheme wouldn't be reintegrated into Kosovo. But then his reaction was completely different a couple of years later due to the way that others in Yugoslavia responded to that. So actively kind of appeasing a base within, almost like a nationalist base within Serbian society, above and overriding the rights of individuals who were actually in Kosovo itself. And you also see this with the implementation of the Alexander Rankovic period in Kosovo, where individuals were facing profound violence. I think it's very important to speak about personal lived experience, so I'd like to share one today. It's quite sensitive, so trigger warning if anybody would like to leave. My great-grandfather was tortured by the Rankovic period in Kosovo during this time. There was a process of disarmament where basically Rankovic's secret police forces would arrive at your house. And oftentimes, if you didn't have a gun, they would take you because they would think that you're lying. So oftentimes, a lot of Albanian communities would have to buy guns in order to give a gun away. It was a very arbitrary process. And my great-grandfather was tortured in several ways. One was through waterboarding, and the other was through his body basically being put into soil for several days, to an extent where he was eventually rendered disabled for the rest of his life. And so these are experiences and inaccuracies, and also inequalities that were established within members of Yugoslav society during that time period. And these are conversations that are often not brought to the surface because sometimes we speak about socialist Yugoslavia as being this kind of socialist utopia for everybody, but the realities on the ground were very much different to that. And so fundamentally, what we need to learn from these experiences of inter-ethnic solidarity, but also the negatives of aspects of this history, is looking back on it to inform our present and understanding that even if one individual is experiencing forms of inequality, that should fundamentally be a problem for all of us, because that is truly the only way that we are able to create more equitable societies that are based in inequality. And this is something that really fuels my work personally, because and I often potentially get some flack for it because I try to be as fair and as accurate as possible in making sure that all communities have access to the rights and self-determination that they need. And so yeah, that was my kind of like my flow regarding the history of kind of inter-ethnic engagement. And there's also one thing that I think that we should also remember. There's a specific quote by Paulo Ferreira, a really fantastic academic from Brazil, and he says the oppressed, instead of striving for liberation, tend themselves to become the oppressors. And this is something that we need to remember, that when an oppressed group often achieves their liberation, they can sometimes then implement forms of oppression towards other groups. And this has been implemented in the Balkans time and time again. You see, for example, various different liberation movements being born during the late Ottoman period, only to then start instigating forms of oppression towards minority communities within these lands as well. And so this is something that we need to collectively look back on and say that this is not the way and this is not the correct process to take to actually move forward to inform societies that are based on liberation.
Yeah, thank you so much. A lot of important points there. One point that I wanted to highlight is this idea of like a common enemy. And I think we'll talk about this a little bit later in the conversation, but it's something to really learn about because I think in many ways, people in the Balkans, we still, in various forms, have common enemies. We have larger powers that are they seek to override our own self-determination, our own ability to make the decisions about how our country is run. For example, in Serbia, we have a lithium mine that is for years now being attempted to open up even against the will of the majority of the people. And the lithium mine is, sponsored by the EU and the US, and so on and so forth. And I know that in Kosovo, there have been various sanctions implemented against the government for attempting to take a road that, the US and other powers do not necessarily want it to go down. So I think that this idea about like a common enemy, we really need to learn from it and apply it to today because of course, yeah, we don't have currently we don't have a fascist occupation of the region, but we still do have that type like exploitation and oppression and the looting of our resources and all of these things unite us. And so I think in that essence, it's really, really important to remind ourselves what we do have in common in these moments. So you did talk about a little bit like positive and negatives in this history. I want to segue a little bit into a particular aspect about Yugoslavian history, and that is the history of the non-aligned movement, which, for people who are not aware, was a movement of countries that during the Cold War asserted that uh, they neither pledged allegiance to the US nor the Soviet Union. They tried to basically forge a third path. And within this movement, there was quite a significant amount of collaboration with anti-colonialist movements, liberation movements. But of course, I think that ultimately there were some limitations, and one of those in terms of Yugoslavia's role was this hypocrisy, as Arbor kind of outlined a bit, where outwardly perhaps Yugoslavia was asserting this leading role in anti-colonialism and asserting it was an anti-imperialist force, but then of course clamping down on the struggle that Albanians were waging for their own rights for equality and ultimately against a colonial system as well. So that irony, can't be lost on us. But also, I think it's important to note that during this time, a few things. So, of course, it was a, different era. There were two, imperialist powers, the Soviet Union bloc and the US. And I think at that time, there was a little bit more leniency for these countries that otherwise perhaps would not have so much freedom to, assert that they were against, imperialism and colonialism. But because of the geopolitical situation, it sort of like allowed itself, these big powers allowed a little bit of leeway. And also that actually during this time, I think that the elites, the capitalist elites around the world were realizing that direct colonialism was actually it was not as efficient of a system anymore because the exploitation was so direct and it was so visible for people in oppressed countries to see. And people were, of course, there were liberation struggles all around the world throughout the 60s and 70s. And so what the capitalist elite really saw was that they would need to basically transform how they were executing this. And so in that sense, they were actually okay with the system of nominal independence, but then really in practice, still subservient to these external interests. So I think that's just important to keep in mind with this era and to avoid over romanticizing it because I think it was not as perhaps straightforward as, some people may think, in my opinion. So anyways, I just wanted to provide a little bit of color for that, but Arbor, what are your thoughts on this question?
Yes, exactly what you said. I think there is kind of like this approach of this of the non-aligned movement being this deeply anti-imperialist force, and Yugoslavia being a part of that. And oftentimes, it's perpetuated in a way that can be really problematic because again, it doesn't focus on what domestically Yugoslavia was doing at that time period and the way that it was engaging with certain communities within its borders, often in deeply colonial ways. And I think it's also important to recognize that Yugoslavia remained heavily dependent on Western financial aid and military support after its break from the Soviet Union in 1948. So, and again, like you said, this was the wider geopolitical structure of the world. States were unable to actually survive if they didn't have support from wider kind of like political powers. It's also very important to recognize that there were various moments in Yugoslavia's history in the 50s and 60s where it saw economic aid from the United States and other Western states, and it also received military support in the form of arms sales from NATO itself. So again, representing that contradiction and that kind of like living within a gray area between East versus West and actively engaging with Western countries that are engaging in forms of imperialism, but then striving to present the notion of it being deeply anti-imperialist. But I think it's also important to recognize that the states don't necessarily represent the people. And so you do see in Yugoslavia and different Balkan states in the 50s, 60s, 70s, individual groups actively going out and supporting Palestinian rights. You also see the first, I think the PLO openly established its first kind of office for let me just look at my notes. I think it was in 1971 that the PLO opened its first organization in Belgrade, and that actively kind of allowed, and this actually led to the ability for a lot of Palestinian students to come and to study in Yugoslavia. And this kind of created that personal connection between individuals within the former Yugoslavia. I know for myself, there were a lot of students that had come down to Pristina, so students from Palestine that came to Kosovo during that time period. And it also created a sense of solidarity between different communities as well. I have like a little bit of a show and tell here, but this is a badge that my dad bought about in the 1970s or so, and it's a Palestinian resistance badge that he bought in the 70s. And he bought it because during that time period, again, there were a lot of Palestinian students coming to Pristina, and he had engaged in a lot of conversation with them, and he recognized the realities of very shared, similar experiences of oppression between Palestinian communities and communities in Kosovo. And so, because my father was born in 1964, and so he grew up towards the end of the Rankovic period in Kosovo during that time. So again, this time was able to establish such fantastic personal connections and relationships between communities in the former Yugoslavia and in Palestine. But from a state-born level, there were profound contradictions between how Yugoslavia was presenting itself within many parts of the world, actively trying to almost have its basically have support from multiple different spaces itself. And when you look at, for example, kind of like its relationship with Israel. So in the late 1940s, Yugoslavia was actually one of the first countries to recognize Israel as a state. And so that is often a profound contradiction that is not often conveyed in this discourse because sometimes it can very much become a conversation regarding the non-aligned movement as being this profoundly, anti-imperialist force when there were many societies and systems a part of this that were perpetuating really deeply problematic behavior and also actively engaging with societies, specifically Israel, that were perpetrating genocide and ethnic cleansing on a mass scale. So, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Um, so I wanted to just say one more thing because you brought up this point about actually in reality Yugoslavia's deep, deep ties with the US and just to give a few, you know, examples. So the one data point that I think is most telling is that throughout the 70s, the Yugoslavia debt just to the US grew ninefold. So it grew from 2 billion to 20 billion in just a few years. And I think we all know that such loans and such debt come with strings attached, especially with a country like the US, just to kind of demonstrate again those ties. And ultimately, actually, that indebtment and that dependence on the US has a direct linkage to what transpired in the end of the 80s in terms of economically, because the Yugoslavia was basically forced by the IMF and World Bank to implement these structural adjustment programs and austerity to deal with the debt, which as such, triggered a larger economic fallout, and that led to kind of pointing fingers and basically where the elite across the country pointed to the other in a way to absolve themselves and avoid blame for that economic crisis. So I think the linkage between these things is really important to understand. And then I also wanted to make a comment just in terms of an idea that's out there about how the world was a better place when there were two competing imperialist powers, the Soviet Union and the US, and how countries had, perhaps this is what some people allege is an argument. These countries have more kind of flexibility, and sort of this is kind of the argument. But I think, and they're advocating for this type of multipolarity now, and as such, kind of encouraging this competition between Russia, China, and the US that we see. And I think it's important to emphasize, throughout those several decades, the world almost came to nuclear war several times. And the competition between these powers was not peaceful, right? And so I think we really have to keep in mind that history when we think about the benefits, if you will, of having multiple competing superpowers that are, basically using the rest of the world as their battleground. Okay, so next, we want to talk a little bit more, still on the topic of, this time period, the 60s, and in particular in Yugoslavia at the time, there was a massive protest movements against the government and various policies. The various things people were criticizing was the growth of inequality, the corruption within even, within the Communist Party, the nepotism and this sort of thing. But also at these protests, which were led by students, there were also a lot of students kind of calling on people to stand in solidarity with people in Vietnam who were under American occupation and attack, and also in Congo, where they were also experiencing American imperialism. But I want to ask Arbor to talk a little about what was going on in Kosovo at that exact time that is less talked about.
Mm. So yeah, I think it's important to kind of convey again like a sense of contradiction regarding this because we see Yugoslavia, like you said, Anna, actively supporting movements in against the Vietnam War and the occupation of Vietnam during that time period, and you also see Yugoslavia actively supporting the Congo crisis during that time period. So actively once more showing and having this very anti-imperialist, anti-colonial stance, and actively kind of leveraging its resources to support these communities worldwide, but then not reflecting on the way that communities internally within its state structure were experiencing profound violence. I mentioned on this before, but Kosovo was under, from 1947 to 1966, Kosovo was under the governance of an individual known as Aleksandar Rankovic. This was a profoundly difficult period in Kosovo's history, especially for Albanian people. They, like I said, experienced forms of intimidation, forms of systematic violence. There was a consistent outpouring of Albanians leaving Kosovo during that period as well. So in the 1950s, three of my mother's uncles left Kosovo indefinitely due to the fact that there were a lack of economic opportunities. There was a lack of political and social representation. Society was deeply hierarchical in terms of on an ethnic structure. So every structure within society was overrepresented by individuals who supported the state policy at that time and was often biased towards Kosovo Serbs or the Serb settlers that had lived in Kosovo during that time. So there was a very clear structure that had been established in Kosovo during that time period. There was also massive kind of protests and movements on behalf of also Albanian students during that time period. Albanian people desperately wanted to advance educationally. So within Kosovo, there was no Albanian education at all levels, meaning from primary to university level, until 1968, when the University of Pristina was finally opened. And so in the 1960s, once more, there was profound disparity within Kosovan community, which really kind of contradicted this wider Yugoslav ideal to establish brotherhood and unity within the former Yugoslavia as a whole, but also provide a sense of equality for the vast majority of its citizens. So it was a very, very difficult time for people. Again, some like familial kind of anecdotal experiences. My dad was about 4 years old when 1968 happened, which was also quite violent protests happening and also quite a violent crackdown. And he remembers just Pristina basically being with cars kind of turned upside down, smoke everywhere, it being an extraordinarily difficult space to exist in during that time period. Obviously, as we see post 1960s with the decentralization of Yugoslavia, the 1974 constitution, Kosovo's status gets upgraded to an autonomous province with more kind of provincial powers. And that kind of like leads into a process or a time period in Kosovo's history where there were more cultural, educational, and social rights. But that's not to say that there weren't still structural issues and discriminations that occurred against individuals in Kosovo. So I guess looking back at Yugoslavia's external and foreign policy regarding different forms of imperial power, whether it be in Vietnam or Congo during that time period, you see Yugoslavia actively showing support for these systems and for these movements, but not looking inwards towards its own state and the realities of what people were experiencing in Kosovo during that time.
Okay, thank you. Great. So, also on this topic about the protest movements around that time, we wanted to also talk a little bit about, I mentioned this earlier, what some of the demands and some of the focuses of that protest movement was around, the rising inequality, the corruption amongst the government, officials and stuff like this. And so wanted to touch on that as well, and tie it in also with what you were talking about and how that's relevant today. So one of the things that I think is very kind of indicative of this inequality that was happening around this time was that the wage differential between managers and workers in the beginning of Yugoslavia's socialist Yugoslavia's existence was about 1 to 3.5. So that was the ratio. So it was very, almost pretty equal there. And over time, over the decades, the ratio by 1967 became 1 to 20. So we can see that just that statistic alone sort of indicates that inequality was not really being tackled in the way that a socialist society claims it will be, and its goal is to do. And then also with those protests that were happening then, I think obviously these points, these grievances were really important. But I think that given what you've talked about with Kosovo at the time, they really missed out on the opportunity to further unite people in Yugoslavia and also to lift up those struggles of Albanian people and as such kind of wage a more effective struggle for a more equitable society. And I think that's also one thing that sticks out to me in the protest movement in Serbia now is that it's very massive and it's very strong, and there's a lot of progressive things about it, especially in terms of advocating for people to organize themselves and to, collectively make decisions, collectively become politicized. Those are all really important things, but at the same time, at these protests, we have a lot of very reactionary and sometimes fascist imagery, especially in relation to Kosovo. And so I think we really need to learn from these movements and where their gaps were and aim to apply those today because ultimately that will strengthen our fight for equality across the Balkans and ultimately help to unite people in this region. But curious for your thoughts as well.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think it's so important to look towards our history and these various different protests and take from them especially with obviously what everything that's happening in Serbia currently. Like you said, Anna, there are like representations of a deeply kind of like ethno-nationalist nature, which can also be very disheartening to see, especially when certain movements regard themselves as being progressive and focused at deconstructing, or actively kind of going against corruption and the system itself. So yeah, I think it's very important to look towards the past in in order to recognize that a lot of these societies were focused at creating idealist societies, and Yugoslavia often postured itself as being, or like the socialist Yugoslavia, as a space that is for everyone and striving for this brotherhood and unity and this equality. But what fundamentally ended up happening is obviously not the case. There were many inequalities, and there was also profound corruption. If you were a part of the Communist Party, if you weren't a part of the Communist Party, you would be guaranteed job opportunities and you would often be given certain privileges due to your status in society. And obviously, this is something that has been massively kind of imploded in the Balkan region post the 90s as well. So I think looking back towards that history and understanding, like you said, the gaps, the inaccuracies, I think is really important. We also got a question in the chat, which we will definitely go through towards the end of this conversation as well.
Perfect. Okay, so now I want to segue a little bit to the question of Palestine and more directly tying together how our struggles here in the Balkans are tied to similar, but also obviously very, very different from the Palestinian people. If you want to get us started on this question.
Yeah, it's obviously we need to understand that the Balkans is not Palestine or the Middle East. We have completely different political and historical context. So I think there is very important to recognize that clear differentiation. I think from my perspective, um, when I look at the Palestinian experience and their experiences of settler colonialism, forced kind of displacement is something that I touch on very personally. So my family are originally from, so members of my mother's family are originally from the Toplica region in southern Serbia, and they were displaced towards the late 19th century into Kosovo. Members of my family were also then displaced in the 1920s to parts of Turkey and Syria. And then members of my mother's family again were displaced in the 50s, and then my parents displaced in the 90s. So this kind of consistent experience of intergenerational displacement is something that I really relate to. And like this inability to experience a system that allows you to just exist is something that I very much can relate to regarding the Palestinian experience. And this is something that the vast majority of Balkan communities can also relate to. Palestinians, as we know, have gone through different forms of genocide, dispossession, forced assimilation at times. And this is something that very much has existed within the Balkan context as well. And so our struggles are tied to these communities due to the base behind them. So these experiences are all forwarded by the ethno-nationalist structure, the desire to create a mono-ethnic state through the use of settler colonialism and other forms of structural implications. And so this is something that we should recognize as being profoundly problematic in the vast majority of our communities and societies. And oftentimes, these experiences become weaponized by the ethno-nationalist state, as we see, for example, Israel actively weaponizes the Holocaust as a way to kind of alleviate responsibility that it has to take. And within the Balkan context, sometimes a lot of governments also use their experiences of genocide and ethnic cleansing and dispossession as a way to alleviate themselves of the responsibilities of the violence that they've also inflicted towards other communities. So I personally have always seen a lot of parallels between my historical experience and my family's historical experience and Palestinians due to the very similar kind of structure that Serbia took with Kosovo, and also then the impact of that amongst Kosovo's communities as well. And then I also, and you also see, for example, we've been some really great content creators have been creating content in the lead up of this conversation. And they've been touching on some really important moments in Kosovo Albanian history where a variety of different writers and artists or figures throughout Albanian history have likened the Palestinian experience to their own writing in a variety of different publications, whether it's Rilindia or Boyko or a whole different other plethora of source material, kind of like relating the Palestinian experience to their struggles internally during the 1980s, especially. And so this is something that's very significant. But what about with you, Anna? Do you feel like how do you relate to that experience as well?
I mean, yeah, I think for our struggles today, I see them as very tied with the fight against, as I mentioned earlier, the fight against, the imperialist oppression and exploitation of our resources. Our region is generally pretty cheap labor for these big countries and these big companies that set up factories here. And so I think we see that with obviously Palestine in a very, very intense way where we have these companies that are, for example, plundering the oil and gas. They want to take all of the oil and gas off the coast of Gaza. And as I mentioned earlier, in Serbia, we have this struggle against a lithium mine that would definitely leave in its trail a lot of environmental degradation that, for example, the EU and the US are really pushing for their own profit. And so I think in that way we see those similarities currently. But to your point, historically, I think, many peoples, many different nations have experienced genocide, ethnic cleansing. And so on that level, like on a humanity level, we can see that these are common experiences, unfortunately. And because of that, but also beyond that, we need to stand in solidarity with the Palestinian people. But those experiences were more historical, I think, than today, like present day. But I think, yeah, just generally those struggles for self-determination for the people who are living in the country, who are indigenous, to have the say over their destiny. I think that's a common struggle for all poor, oppressed countries around the world. And so on that topic, because we mentioned earlier that across the Balkans, many of us were fighting these struggles, and we have several common enemies, if you will. But what really needs to happen before we can kind of collaborate and tackle those things the way that Boro and Ramiz maybe did is a lot of work, a lot of internal work for us in the Balkans, just to deal with these structures of oppression, these inequalities that have existed. And so I want to get your take also on that. Like what do you see as needed to facilitating that collaboration?
Yeah, I think it's a difficult one because I think in order to unite us as communities across completely different identities and lived experiences, we definitely have to acknowledge the impact of historical dynamics first and foremost. Although we all come from the Balkan region, we all do have very specific lived experiences, and oftentimes it can be very difficult and almost like an echo chamber of individuals sometimes like listening to their own voices and just kind of like agreeing with one another about what a certain experience during a certain time period is, and that often kind of makes individuals that do have different and diverse lived experiences not kind of speak up about what they've gone through. So I think first and foremost, there has to be an acknowledgement of historical dynamics. There has to be building conversations based in respect, based in transnational justice, and also the desire to actually find the root cause of a certain issue within communities. And I think this is something that within a lot of Balkan spaces, ex-Yugo spaces, there is a real hesitancy to engage with the difficult and uncomfortable moments in certain histories. And I completely understand that because for certain communities, what came post Yugoslavia was completely detrimental and worse to to when Yugoslavia existed. And so I completely hold space and I recognize that. But we also then have to recognize the impact of Yugoslavia for certain communities. And I speak as somebody whose parents were quite privileged in Yugoslavia. Both of my parents were born and raised in Pristina. My mother identifies as Turkish. They experienced, I guess you could say, the Yugoslav realities of that time. Um, and and so that's why we need to be able to acknowledge these historical dynamics and the way that they impacted on communities. And if we don't, we're running the risk of just regurgitating very similar structures within our communities. As somebody who's in the diaspora and works quite closely with Balkan communities, although we very much can relate to one another culturally and we can connect, sometimes these issues do come up and they do kind of resurface, and it does become an uncomfortable conversation. And as somebody who's from Kosovo myself, I actively want to engage in these uncomfortable conversations so that we're able to bridge the gap and try to find some sense of solidarity and also find a common goal against struggle and against these systems of ethno-nationalism that have caused so much pain for all of us as communities within our respective contexts as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I just wanted to say a little bit on that in terms of I think that in order to deal with these questions, there's a lot of different approaches that are advocated for. You know, some people, some organizations are already working on certain approaches where kind of you need to talk things through and get in a room and hash it out right away and deal with the history. And that's not necessarily a bad approach, but I think there's also other potential strategies in terms of these struggles that do unite us, bringing us together, whether it's a shared struggle, like, for example, right now, there's also a shared struggle in Bosnia as well as in Serbia against lithium mining. And people in both countries have united, they're communicating, they're coordinating things, and that's really great. And I think like eventually there will be a need to deal with historically the inequalities between those two countries, between Serbs and Bosniaks. I mean, even today in Serbia, the structures that exist with Muslims in the country, I think those systems need to be tackled and dealt with and ultimately eliminated and dismantled. But I think that it's important to take it in stride. And I think absolutely we need to do both, but we can't just do one and not the other. We can't, just say, let's let bygones be bygones and just focus on today, because ultimately these divisions that, are several in different cases, centuries old with Kosovo and stuff like that. Those divisions and that distrust, it's not going to spontaneously fix itself or disappear. I think it really is going to take a concerted effort by people to deal with that history and yeah, reckon with it. I think you and I have spoken a lot about this because I think that there is a struggle with this idea in Serbia in particular because of this resistance to this kind of like collective guilt. But when we talk about reckoning with something, we don't necessarily mean, you have to feel bad about yourself because you're Serbian. Like you just, it's about recognizing the privileges and the historical, inequalities that have existed and that our state did in our name, like it's not about hating yourself. And I think unfortunately that is sort of where the discourse is a little bit sometimes. And so some people have this knee-jerk reaction, but it's really not about that. I mean, unless you took part in genocide and ethnic cleansing. Like, there's no need to, feel that visceral kind of like guilt. I think it's just about having an honest conversation and hearing, other people out. I think like that is really what's missing in this space. Just like I think, and we'll talk about this, but just a willingness to be uncomfortable and to hear things maybe that aren't what you heard and to challenge those things. And I hope that this can be, one conversation that starts that off. And
Mhm.
so on the question. We wanted to keep going and talk a little bit more about this question of solidarity, right? Like, what even is it? I think it's thrown around a lot. And a lot of people have different definitions of it. So I wanted to get your take, maybe just to kick it off on how you see this question, and we can open it up a little bit.
I think that the point of solidarity and uncomfortability is something that is really important for me. As somebody obviously from Kosovo, you can understand, and I'm sure many people in the chat and in the call can understand that being from Kosovo presents a very politicized lived experience. And oftentimes when I meet people from the former Yugoslav space or from the Balkan space, there is this there is this desire to not engage with uncomfortable subjects because it again makes them feel uncomfortable. And so I guess solidarity for me would be seeing individuals who come from certain communities actively making themselves uncomfortable to learn about these histories and to learn about these experiences and to actively question their biases about what they know regarding Kosovo because one experience that I faced is that a lot of people within the ex-Yugoslav space, they see Kosovo in a certain way, but they don't know the realities of what actually happened on the ground historically. Mentioning things like settler colonialism, not just in, the interwar period or the 60s, but also in the 90s as well, is something that often creates this knee-jerk reaction of, oh, this didn't happen, this isn't true. But then recently the discourse has definitely changed and people are more open to hearing. I think another thing is also being um, as an individual that obviously is dedicated to Kosovo, specializing in Kosovo. A lot of my research is focused on that, but sometimes it can be very re-traumatizing for myself to actively kind of engage in certain conversations with communities that have the resources to learn this by themselves sometimes. And as somebody who loves kind of like educating others, I'm happy to do it, but there are also moments where on a mental and emotional level, I'm not willing to engage in that conversation. And there are also ways that we can potentially communicate better with one another as Balkan people. A very recent example, a friend of mine who is Serbian. I have a lot of Serbian friends because obviously I don't judge my friendship on ethnicity. But she decided to, I was critiquing an ethno-nationalist post, and the kind of knee-jerk reaction in the comment that she replied to me was, "What about churches in Kosovo?" So there was no relevance to me even referencing churches, but the knee-jerk reaction was, "What about churches?" As though I had made a claim that I agree or support the destruction of cultural relics in Kosovo, which is against everything I believe in as a person, especially as an individual in the art and cultural industry. So I guess um, having more respect, being more respectful in the way that we communicate with one another, not using stereotypes to engage with one another, not falling back on these historical tropes to communicate, I think is really important as well. And solidarity also means being in spaces where we're able to also support one another as communities as well. So vouch for one another. Bring up, for example, if you're in a space where it's just ex-Yugoslav people and it's becoming somewhat of a microcosm of just like echo chamber of just like, communicating with one another, why not, implement another thought process? Why not implement um, another opinion on a certain issue to have that kind of like intersectional approach? I think that's always really important as well. And obviously, we can focus on the more kind of like physical acts of solidarity, like divesting, which have been really important when it comes to the Palestinian cause as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to also comment a little bit on the topic of Palestine because from my background in the US, obviously in the spring we all know that there was a massive movement that erupted on campuses in support of Palestinian liberation, and I think that was a really, really inspiring level of solidarity where these students were taking on extreme personal risk and actually ultimately in a lot of cases enduring that risk, actually, paying the price, either being, suspended or expelled or targeted, doxxed, any of these things. And these people that are living in the US, a lot of them have, various comforts, and they don't necessarily need to do these things, but they're standing in solidarity because the US is facilitating the genocide of Palestine in, the US's name and with American ta tax dollars and all of this stuff. And, I think that was a really beautiful kind of example of solidarity. It's not just these kind of symbolic gestures, but it's really about ultimately putting yourself on the line sometimes, risking things. Obviously, I'm not advocating for people to take very extraordinary risks that are, risks to their safety and well-being all the time. Of course not. I just think that we really want to get away from this kind of metaphor of solidarity and kind of get into the concrete um, elements that really, really make up what that word is. And I also wanted to offer another anecdote on that topic because in this movement in Serbia, this enormous mass movement, there was a photo that came out a few weeks ago in this town called Novi Pazar, where there were mass protests also organized there. And Novi Pazar is majority Muslim and it's majority Bosniak. And there was a photo that came out of a Bosniak student and a Serb student, both at the protest, both wearing kind of like traditional garb next to one another. It went really viral and it was beautiful, but ultimately, that really didn't challenge, I think, any structures in the Serbian state that do discriminate or, underinvest in that region. And so I think we need to, that's a great starting point, but I just think that it's really not enough. And I think we need to see that it's kind of our responsibility to be creative and to learn about what, different groups of people are experiencing and how we can either support their struggle or unite in a common struggle, and then really, go from there. So I believe this is it for the formal portion, Arbor, unless there was something else you wanted to end on before we segue into questions.
I think we can go into questions now.
Okay, so we have a few questions that we sourced from Instagram and otherwise that people submitted. We also have some questions in the chat. Which ones do you think we should tackle first?
Should we go with pre-questions or these questions?
Um, I think maybe with the questions with people in the meeting, maybe we start there, but we can also alternate. We can take one in the chat and do one from the pre-sourced list. What do we think?
So, yeah.
Okay. So we can start with this first question that we sourced previously. Someone asked, what can solidarity movements do to create support for people facing bureaucratic and social exclusion? So there was a text limit, so we don't know exactly the particulars of this, so we can both maybe respond a little bit in the abstract and kind of take it
Mm.
whichever way we want. What do you think?
Can you repeat that? Because it was so
Yes.
well.
Yeah. So, what can solidarity movements do to create support for people facing bureaucratic and social exclusion?
Oh, wow. Mm.
So, I take that to mean along the lines of what we were talking about with taking personal risk. Perhaps these people, let's just say in the Palestinian movement, in the Palestinian liberation movement, they get fired from their job for speaking out, or they get, suspended from university, something like this. And how can we support those people, let's just say in the abstract? Well, I mean, I think the major thing is having the movement be a community, a support community for people, to help them in various ways. I mean, ultimately, some of these things require some material help. If you get expelled from your student housing, how do you find new housing? People think can be really supportive about those things. But I think besides that, it's really just about, creating a sense of community, being there for one another to experience these, I would say if this could qualify as some sort of repression. And yeah, just learning about also ways to fight back, if someone is abducted, like we're having in the US for being pro-Palestine, then how do we deal with that? How do we, advocate for them? How do we, get them out? These are all things I think that a movement and a community has to has to deal with and grapple with. I don't think there's any silver bullet for this type of question, but this is my take.
Yeah, I definitely would echo your sentiment. I think leveraging your privilege as a person, I think is really important, whether financial, whether on a gendered basis, or just leveraging your resources to support communities, I think is really important. And there's always been those individuals that have leveraged their abilities to outsource, I think, throughout history. So I think and also just creating safe spaces for more marginalized communities that face repression in more ways than you, I think is very important. So creating spaces where they don't have to be impacted by certain ideologies, I think is really important because struggles and movements of liberation are often extraordinarily exhausting and very difficult for communities to undergo. So leveraging your your resources, I think, is really important.
Absolutely. All right, so now we'll jump into the chat. I think the first question, I think you already answered this a bit. I don't know if you want to go into depth about the emigration due to favoritism in Kosovo, or should we? I know you sent a link, but
Yeah,
if
I
you
sent a
want
link
to,
to some resources.
Mhm.
Um, in terms of favoritism towards Serbs, um, so within Yugoslavia in the 1960s, in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, there was this distrust about Albanian people, believing that obviously they wanted to unify with Albania and they weren't trustworthy and they were like these irredentists. There's a variety of different resources that I can provide to you after this conversation as well. If you'd email or like send us a message in on our Instagram. But there were very much structural limitations for Albanian people. And when you do look at certain resources and when you look at certain information, very clearly see that Serbian or Slavic communities in Kosovo were overrepresented when it came to educational facilities, when it came to medical facilities, when it came to governance in society as a whole.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so I'll jump back to the pre-sourced questions. We have another question. How do acts of resistance help imagining alternative futures for people who feel stuck in the system?
Mm.
Acts of resistance help imagining alternative futures. It's a very inspiring question, you know?
Yes. Acts of resistance, inspiring alternative futures. I think um within a lot of my work, I desperately want to imagine alternative futures, especially for Kosovo, due to the realities of what it's faced. I think resisting ethno-nationalism is something that I try to do in my in my daily life. And it can often land me in really difficult situations and scenarios with individuals who potentially don't agree with with what I believe, but I think it can allow us to think of futures and spaces where we aren't solely focused on ethnic identity, but focused on other aspects of our identities that bring us so much closer. And I think that's something that I like to think about, and I like to resist a lot of dominant status quos within my community.
Yeah. Yeah, I would just add, I think when people resist and they experience repression, it really, brings people closer together and people I think, will go out of their way to be there for other people and help others out. I mean, not just when there's a campaign of repression. I think there's instances of that happening all the time in our society, although, maybe not as often as we'd like. But I think, even just those kind of glimmers of community, which isn't based on like exchange or transactions or what you're looking to get out of another person. I think those can be really helpful in seeing what kind of future really is possible if we all come together and struggle through these, various forms of oppression and whatnot. Okay, so we'll go back to the chat. Um, I'm sorry, there's a lot of questions.
Conversation happening as well.
Yes, there is. It's good. Okay, I think a lot of these are conversations, so I will just go back to the questions we have. All right, next we have what common struggles do we share with Palestine? We kind of tackled that, so I'm gonna skip that. Why should we care about Palestine's independence as Balkan peoples? Do you want to kick that off? I know that there's also specific kind of intricacies in Kosovo about this.
Yes. Well, fundamentally, we should support Palestinian independence because they deserve to uh, have full self-determination in their ancestral and native homeland. It's just like a natural response for communities to be able to be the masters of their own destiny, and that is something that they've had actively been taken away from them through colonial and neo-colonial forces of either being under the British mandate or then going Israel forcing itself and encroaching on the Palestinian ability to forge a state within their own ancestral land, which is so utterly important to communities to be able to have independence, especially for communities of peoples who have faced such discrimination. And it's not something that just Palestinians face, but you see it with Kurdish communities. You see it with, obviously, in Kosovo, communities of people who have lived under a system where their rights have always been capped or dangled above their heads. It creates such a necessity for independence that it has to be seen and it has to be experienced and it has to be lived out. Obviously, there is this discourse within Kosovo that frames because obviously Palestine didn't recognize Kosovo's independence and vice versa. Kosovo is positioned as being allied with the West. Palestine is positioned as being allies with the East. But I find that conversation and that dynamic to be very simplistic because fundamentally um, the people of Kosovo support the people of Palestine, as we've seen in the protests and taking place in Kosovo itself, due to these lived historical experiences between our communities as well. And you see multiple different moments throughout history where both Palestinians and Albanians in Kosovo have actively shown up for each other. And although, obviously, from a geopolitical perspective, governments have to say certain things and do certain things in order to achieve their goals, that doesn't necessarily relate and convey what the people of these places are thinking and feeling.
Yeah, I would also just note that when you reference Palestine, you're talking about the Palestinian Authority, right? Which is not necessarily, I mean, it's basically a co-occupier of the Palestinian people and collaborates with Israel. And so we really have to see that as you've already pointed out, that it's perhaps not, it's very much not reflective of what the Palestinian people, I think, want or believe in or what is in their interest to do. And I also wanted to say in terms of the why should we care? I think ultimately all of the things that are happening in Palestine come back and spread around the world, really, because the world is connected. And I think the forms of oppression and, genocide and all of these things, torture that are happening there, they're not just going to stay sequestered to Palestine. And we see that with, for example, I saw a graphic, an infographic recently about the US military war machine and how the rise of the very, very extensive military equipment that was being deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan was all redeployed in the US police system. And so all of those weapons that were used in the US's wars of aggression came back and now are used on American people. So just in that instance, it's kind of like these things are always connected, and we should really see that as a common interest when we're fighting for Palestine. We're also fighting for our own interests against this type of oppression. All right. So next we will go to a question about the Balkan identity. And Uh, okay, I will just read it. Vanya says, sometimes I wonder what makes us Balkan. What is it that really unites us? Did someone and who imposed this identity, or did we choose it and reclaim it? Should we embrace it or maybe also question it to a certain extent? as something that we play out to satisfy other people's imaginations of what the Balkan people are. For example, Balkanization, which is like the breakup of a region. And what is the European Union's role in that identity negotiating? Do we identify more with it as the diaspora people than others? Is it a different or new identification or not? So, several questions in one, but I feel like you are the best person for this question.
That is a question that's like a whole PhD topic. I think what I've learned through my research and just being existing in the space, we need to being Balkan or Balkan identity is not something that can be identified in a specific type of way. For individuals who, like, I'm from Kosovo, my identity as a Balkan person is completely different to individuals from Serbia or from Croatia or even within countries itself, regionally, it can be completely different. Um, and definitions of Balkan have obviously fluctuated throughout history. Recently, there's obviously been this push to move the Balkans to Southeastern Europe. So, kind of like to reintegrate the Balkans into Europe, this kind of very problematic relationship that the Western world has had with the Balkans as a whole. But I think Balkan identity is something that is very individual and personal to the individual themselves. Obviously, there are certain cultural markers that we all relate to, whether it be food, whether it be music, whether it be traditional clothing. But even then, there's so much diversity and individuality, depending on the region you come from or the community you identify as being a part of. I see being Balkan as more of an expansive term rather than solely specific. Sometimes individuals can get, for example, people would debate whether Greece is Balkan, people would debate whether Turkey is Balkan, and like these periphery states. So it's a very convoluted discussion and one that is consistently ongoing, and not one that I feel like can be clearly defined. And I'm most definitely not the individual to define anybody else's identity for them. I personally identify with being Balkan because although my parents are from Kosovo, my like I said, I've got ancestry from Serbia. I've got family members in Macedonia, in Turkey, in Albania, relations to Bosnia as well. So my history is so massively interwoven and dispersed within this community. And I think a lot of us can relate to that as well. A lot of us have experiences and cultural connections to so many different communities in the region. So I think it's an expansive term. It's not something that can be clearly defined by anyone, really.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think, like a lot of identities, they are kind of ever evolving. Like I think perhaps what was considered Balkan like 100 years ago probably has shifted like a little bit in different ways. I think they're not static and they don't have to be. I think it's up to us how we want to interpret it. And I think I also definitely relate and identify with that. And I really love the kind of shared history across different countries in the region, and of course, obviously the differences and respecting those as well, and learning about new cultures. I think it's all, I think, the strength of the Balkans. So I personally am okay with it. But I think, yeah, of course, we're not in any position to tell people or dictate how people wanna identify.
For sure.
Okay, so we have one more question and then I think we'll wrap up. But here, this is also for you. I can also comment a little bit. But anyways, do you think normalization between Kosovo's ethnic groups is possible in the near future? What do
A
you
very
think?
um, I think there is obviously from my perspective, I can be a quite idealistic on this, and I'm so desperate for Kosovo's ethnic communities to be able to live in freedom and have access to the rights that they need, and also start to forge relations between each other. Obviously, there are movements and there are initiatives in Kosovo and trying to desperately improve relations, but as we know, the situations are quite dire between communities. And that's something that really makes me really sad because a big part of my research is looking at Kosovo before kind of like the scheme of settler colonialism in the interwar period and looking at people's relationships. And because oftentimes there can be this ancient hatred theory, which is also big in academia, that presents the notion that Kosovo's communities have always just been at war with each other and always hated each other and never gotten along. And that has been true at certain parts of Kosovo's history. I'm not here to present a romanticized depiction, but I think I look to history, and I look at the relationships that are also massively a part of my family's history and story and oral history telling. And I look at those experiences to inform the way that I do work personally. So I obviously have created a lot of friendships with individuals that support similar ideals to what I do. I've also tried to provide representation for communities, diverse communities within Kosovo as well. And that's something that really informs my work. So I'm really just desperate for better discussion to be had, communities coming together, conversating with one another about these issues, and trying to move forward for a Kosovan society that is based in transitional justice, equality, and freedom for all of its communities.
Beautifully said. I did want to just address one other question or comment. Someone asked why we have not invited someone from Palestine to speak here. So just to say that this is not going to be the only event we do. We will do lots of other events, and we're happy to integrate, other people, Palestinians, and otherwise when we talk about other solidarity struggles too. I think, you know. Arbor and I both, of course, we're not Palestinian, but we both have spent quite a bit of time learning about Palestine and fighting in the solidarity movement. So I think we were just providing our experience and our opinions on the linkage. But of course, as we said, we're not experts. So this is not the end, this is the beginning. So. With that, I want to thank everyone for coming. I thought this was a really helpful discussion, and I always love talking with Arbor. We could talk for hours, I know. And yeah, I think we solved Serbia Kosovo, right? I think it's done.
If only.
No, but as I said, please do get involved. Please do leave your information. We will send the sign up link again. And someone asked, where can we find information on upcoming events? Yes, so we do have a Instagram and a Facebook currently. On Instagram, I believe the username is just Balkan Solidarity. So that should be really easy to find. And I think probably it's something around the same on Facebook, but we'll link that probably in our Instagram as well. So thank you, thank you, thank you to everyone. Thank you, Arbor, for a fantastic conversation. And yes, the recording will be available. We will post it and we will post clips and everything. And we hope to see you soon. Arbor, thank you.
Bye bye, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.